In the context of the Russian and the Ukrainian war, I just felt that I should share some facts and figures about where do we stand, what are the ground realities. You know, Russia's justification of securing its national interest, while legitimate, is no excuse for its military aggression in a sovereign country like Ukraine. But speaking of justification, is it justified that the US and NATO could install weapons, include nuclear warheads in proximity to the Russian border? Is it right to call the Russian invasion an unprovoked act of aggression while inviting a country right on the Russian border into an anti-Russian alliance? You are inviting to the NATO alliance and you expect Russia to keep mum. If today we sympathize with Ukraine, shouldn't our sentiments have been equally strong for Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Palestine? The US-led NATO and the USSR-led Warsaw Pact were both security alliances in the aftermath of the Second World War. While the Warsaw Pact was disbanded in the post-Cold War, NATO persisted and flourished. NATO's promise to the USSR not to expand an inch towards the east, which the US today denies, is reflected in hundreds of memos, meeting minutes, and transcripts from the US archive. The NATO alliance has grown from 12 to 30 since 1949. In 1999, Russia's close neighbors and ex-Warsaw Pact members, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria joined NATO. In 2004, Russia's border countries like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the last only 160 kilometers from St. Petersburg, joined NATO. In 2008, NATO promised membership to Georgia and Ukraine, the latter's distance being less than 500 kilometers from Moscow. Is it not a cause of worry to Moscow? In 2017, Montenegro and North Macedonia joined NATO. It is also reportedly planning to induct Bosnia and Herzegovina, Finland, Sweden, and Serbia. NATO has conducted regular military exercises in Eastern Europe, deployed troops and nuclear missiles, emerging as a direct threat to Russia. You give a direct threat to Russia and Russia is going to keep mum. Is it expected? Is it expected of any country? In 2007 itself, the Russian president asked at the annual Munich conference, quote unquote, against whom is this expansion intended? What happened to the assurance that our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? He asked, and there was no answer. Even American personalities have protested. In June 1997, 50 prominent foreign policy experts wrote to Bill Clinton, the then US president, calling NATO expansion, quote, a policy error of historic proportions, unquote. Cold War veteran George Kennan calls NATO expansion, quote, a tragic mistake, unquote. In 2018, Williams J. Burns, former US ambassador to Moscow, wrote a letter to the State Department calling Ukrainian entry to NATO, quote, one of the brightest red lines to the Russian elite, unquote. Last but not the least, Robert M. Gates, former defense secretary, wrote in his memoir that, quote, trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching, unquote. Ukraine, a hub of defense industries, factories, military installations, and nuclear power plants, was a critical constituent of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. After the USSR disintegrated in 1991, the loss of Ukraine was a big political and strategic loss for Russia, the successor of the then called Soviet Union. A vast majority of Ukrainian public wanted close bilateral ties with Europe, and a civil unrest broke out in the form of Euromaidan protests, resulting in a change in government, which was a pro-West one. As it happened in all parts of the globe, people tend to be going towards the West. Needless to say, this coup was sponsored by the US and the European countries. Subsequently, fresh protests ensued in Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. Russia took this opportunity to annex the Crimean Peninsula, which was legitimized by a referendum. Once a part of the medieval superpower, Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine and Belarus have close civilizational and cultural links. There is still a large Russian-speaking population in Eastern Ukraine. In fact, the Donbas region in Eastern Ukraine is inhabited by pro-Russian separatist groups which receive considerable financial support, military equipment and training from Russia. In 2014, the beginning of the tumult when the then Russian government refused to sign an agreement with the European Union to preserve ties with Russia. The Minsk agreement signed between Russia and Ukraine to ensure ceasefire and demilitarization in assurance of granting autonomy to LPR and DPR did not yield any fruitful results. In 2021, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's urge to speed up the country's NATO membership triggered a military buildup of 1 lakh troops, battle tanks and artillery guns on Ukraine's eastern, northern and southwestern borders. In the US-Russia talks in January 2022, Russia sought a written guarantee for the following. The US remained firm on NATO's open door policy. Any sovereign country is free to decide if it wants to join NATO, and NATO has every right to place troops, conduct drills, and extend diplomatic as well as military support to them. However, if the US was so serious about giving security assistance to Ukraine, it is not clear why NATO membership could not be granted to Ukraine even after 13 years and NATO resources deployed across the border with Russia. Their clauses were 1. Withdrawal of NATO troops and the weapons from all European countries that joined after 1997, which notably excludes ex-Soviet countries such as Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and erstwhile Warsaw Pact members such as Poland and Hungary. The promise that Ukraine, Georgia would not join NATO as a larger attempt to stop NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. They also said, the third point, no military drills in Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Georgia. By neither accepting Russia's demands and nor extending explicit support to Ukraine, the US and the European Union have an equal responsibility in keeping the conflict stove alive. The US and the European Union put more and more sanctions on Russia, but not a single American soldier will be seen fighting on Ukraine soil. Is it not something which calls for questions? You are provoking Ukraine and then you are not giving support. Isolating Russia is not an easy task for the Western Europe either, as 40% of Europe's oil and gas is sourced from Russia, and that's a great part. The US, of course, wants to take this opportunity to strengthen its strategic and economic influence in Europe and emerge as a key energy supplier. Ukraine, which hopped on the pro-West bandwagon, had to fight a lonely battle. Is fighting a lonely battle. If we complain about Russia intervening in Ukraine's internal affairs, is it right to believe that Ukraine will be able to exercise its sovereignty if it allies with the US and other European countries? I don't think so. Ukraine's fate hangs between Russia and the West. Ukraine would just be a springboard for the US to threaten the Russian military. The Russian response is actually reminiscent of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The same US, which today so vehemently deplores the Russian attempt to overthrow Ukraine's democratic government, did just the same to the communist government in Cuba, albeit the attempt was unsuccessful. As Cuba sought USSR's aid, the latter deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba. Notably, US deployed nuclear missiles were already extant in Italy and Turkey. While a diplomatic solution was reached, the US's 90 B-60 nuclear bombs in Turkey are still present at the Incirlik air base. Is the US and Western Europe the sole custodian of democracy, which they want to bring to the rest of the world? The inherent systematic racism and the hypocrisy of the Western media has never been so blatant before. A BBC News reporter felt emotional because he saw refugees with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. Such statements. A CNBC News reporter from the US says, these are not refugees from Syria. They're white, they're Christians, they're very similar to us. Syrian refugees, of course, being dark-skinned and dark-haired, deserve no sympathy. It has to be kept under consideration, active consideration, that with few natural borders, the Arctic in the north and the Pacific in the east, Russia has always been vulnerable to attack by the West. In 1812, if we just recount history, we should remember that in 1812, Napoleon, and in 1941, the German Nazi invaded Russia. Today, if the US places Tomahawk land attack missiles in Ukraine, they can hit Moscow in a matter of 35 minutes, and the hypersonic missiles can cut down the time to only 5 minutes, just 5 minutes. The US, living on the other side of the ocean, faces no threat to the territory from the big country, but it enjoys going around everywhere in the world to brew turmoil. Another reporter for CBS News US says, this isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. It is relatively civilized, relatively European city. So Iraq and Afghanistan are uncivilized, uncultured countries with irresponsible regimes who deserve war, bombings, and years of occupation. In 2015, when bombs were dropped on West Asia and 1.5 million refugees flee from Syria, Afghanistan, and Nigeria sought asylum in Europe, the West shut its door, hit them with shells and tear gases, herded them with cattle, and branded them as terrorists. Why did not they receive the warm welcome that Ukrainians are receiving today? Even FIFA, along with UEFA, the International Olympic Committee, and others have swiftly joined the West's anti-Russia measures as a result of the latter's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Palestinians and their supporters are puzzled. Years of relentless advocacy to sanction Israel at international sports competition have paid little or no dividends at all. This has continued to be the case despite the numerous documented facts of Israel's intention targeting of Palestine stadiums, travel restriction on athletes, the cancellation of sports events, the arrest and the even killing of Palestine footballers. Now it's a very important point that I'm going to mark upon. It's India's position. Coming to India's position today, the West is trying to chastise India, the world's largest democracy, for avoiding an open condemnation of Russia's actions, highlighted by its abstention from resolutions at the UNSC and the UNGA. All India is doing, however, is to guard its strategic autonomy and national interests, which it should do under no duress. It should have been done before, if it happened before, and it should be done now. India is doing the correct thing, as I consider. On the other hand, India has consistently called for peace and a diplomatic solution to the crisis. India has not forgotten history. The history that I would like to remind. India has not forgotten his history. In 1961, US and UK moved a resolution of the UNSC condemning the use of force by India in Goa, Daman and Diu, while India was ensuring the liberation of these territories from Portuguese. It was the USSR that vetoed it. When Pakistan's defeat in 1970 war seemed imminent, Kissinger spurred Nixon to send the US 7th Fleet's task force led by the nuclear-powered aircraft USS Enterprise to the Bay of Bengal. The USS Enterprise was being dispatched to secure American citizens in Bangladesh was the official American statement. Unofficially, it was threaten the Indian forces and prevent the liberation of Pakistan, or East Pakistan to be particular. Soviet intelligence soon reported to India that another powerful British naval group led by the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle with commando carrier HMS Albion, several destroyers and other ships were approaching the India's territorial waters from the west towards the Arabian Sea. The British and the Americans planned a coordinated pincer attack to intimidate India. The British ships in the Arabian Sea will target India's western course. And what will the Americans do? They would make a dash to Chittagong. Caught between the British and the American ships was the Indian Navy. It was December 1971, and the world's two leading democracies were now threatening the world's largest democracy. An SOS from Delhi was sent to Moscow. The Red Navy soon dispatched 16 Soviet naval units and 6 nuclear submarines from Vladivostok to block US Enterprise. Admiral N. Krishnan, the chief of the Eastern Command of the Indian Navy, wrote in his book, "No way," but surrendered, that he was afraid that the Americans would reach Chittagong. He mentions how they even thought of attacking Enterprise in a do-or-die move to slow it down. On December 2nd week, 1971, the US 7th Fleet's task force, led by the monstrous USS Enterprise arrived in the Bay of Bengal. The British fleet was arriving in the Arabian Sea. Remember this once. The world held its breath, but unknown to the Americans, the submerged Soviet submarines had overtaken them. And USS Enterprise moved towards east, Pakistan. The Soviet submarines surfaced without any warning. The Soviet subs were now standing between the India and the US naval force. The Americans were nothing but just shocked. Admiral Gordon told the 7th American Fleet Commander, "Sir, we are too late, the Soviets are here." Both the American and the British fleets backed off. When the people of Bangladesh were being plundered, raped and murdered by Pakistan, US moved one resolution after the other against India for extending support to Bangladesh, all of which were vetoed by Russia. Russia is not only a long-standing ally but a major defense partner of India. 2/3 of Russian arms are still imported from Russia. 60% of military inventories of Russian origin and old weapons need to be repaired, refurbished and serviced with Russian assistance. The army's main battle tanks are the Russian T-72 and T-90s. The Navy's only operational aircraft is a refurbished Soviet-era ship, and of the Air Force's 667 plane fleet, more than 70% is of Russian origin. It is only natural that India, by remaining neutral, keeps its ties with Russia secure, which is very much required for the sovereignty of India. Now I come to the concluding part, and that is, how is India being punished? Well, thousands of Indian students are stuck to the Poland border at negative temperature without shelter, food or money. Ukrainian border guards are not allowing them through checkpoints, and asking for bribes up to $200 for the safe passage. Perhaps it is time to take a deeper look at the reality of the situation and hold all sides accountable. I do feel that I have tried to justice to the facts, enumerating with the figures and reminiscing the history of what has happened and what India is doing right at this point of time. India has taken the right course of action. India should guard its interest, and that India has done. Russia has been a long partner, but definitely war is not something which is expected of any country to. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind the aggression of the US through its alliance called NATO, and I think it will give, whatever I spoke will give a deeper insight into the current scheme of things happening in that part of the world.